This week on Quadriga, Super Poll, Europe has its say. About 400 million people are entitled to vote in this week's European parliamentary elections. At stake are issues from the ongoing financial crisis to unemployment to immigration. The European Parliament is the only EU institution whose members are elected directly by the bloc's citizens, and its powers have continuously grown. Even so, polls show few voters plan to cast ballots this time around, at least for established parties. Right-wing and Eurosceptic parties are expected to do well in the election. How can Europe reignite passion for the European project and win back citizen trust? Your host this week, Ali Aslan.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. Europe is headed to the polls. Up to 400 million Europeans are being asked to cast their vote this week. But what are the issues that is on the minds of the European voters? And do the politicians paying attention? That is what I want to talk about on today's show, together with these three individuals. Welcome to Stefano Casertano, who is a political journalist and author, serving currently as the Berlin correspondent for the Italian newspaper Pagina 99. He holds a PhD from Potsdam University, where he researches in the area of international relations. David Charter is the Berlin correspondent for the British daily newspaper The Times of London, as well as the author of the books Au revoir, Europe, What if Britain left the EU, and the newly published Europe, In or Out, Everything You Need to Know. And Ulrike Gero is the managing director of the Simon Weil Center in Berlin. Previously, she headed the Berlin office of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome to you all. A lot to talk about on this show, so let's get right to it. David Charter. 751 seats are up for grasp in the European Parliament, as well as the office and position of the new president of the European Commission. Now, this is, everybody says so anyway, this is a very pivotal time in European history. This is a very crucial election. Why?
It's a pivotal time because Europe has been failing the people. Let's be clear, over the last 5 years, people have been looking for answers to their national governments and to the people who run Europe, and they've not been finding answers which please them. Will that translate into votes and into turnout today in the European elections? I don't know, because people do not see exactly how they can influence what is done on the European level by voting in this election. But it's true, if you look at the sweep of history, this has got to be one of the most crucial times, with the most power ever vested in the hands of the members of the European Parliament than we've ever seen before, thanks to the Lisbon Treaty. And yet, there is a lot of there's a lot of apathy out there, which is kind of understandable if you think that Europe has not been able to find good solutions to the financial crisis.
And indeed, Ulrike Gero, this is the moment everybody's saying. This is the moment where Europe will have to show its true colors. And this is the very first time that the EU is headed to the polls since the outbreak of the euro crisis. But as David Charter pointed out correctly, there's apathy. There's apathy across the European continent. There seems to be a mismatch here between the importance of this election and the excitement out there.
Well, in a way, I agree. On the other hand, we are basically pointing to the historical moment, also 1914, 2014. Now's the time that Europe needs to shape and live up to its potential and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we are analyzing that basically voters' interest, voters' mobilization is going down. We will have probably less turnout than last, or around 50% or so. But in comparison with national elections, it's not really much. So there's this apathy, and I think, to picking up on what David said, the crucial thing seems seems to be that the European system seems to be in a sort of catch-22. The system is now able to provide the solution that we actually need to improve the eurozone, to make it happen for citizens, to really activate European democracy, to give space for citizens' opinions in the whole system, and so on and so forth. And therefore we are running into a dichotomy between technostructure on the one hand and populism on the other hand. And then this is basically, I think, what explains the apathy.
And Stefano Casertano, if we look at the numbers, they are indeed troublesome. A recently published poll says the trust in the EU across the member states, across the 28 member states, have fallen to 31%. That's down from 57% in 2007. Now, of course, one of the reasons can and probably is the euro crisis, with 50% youth unemployment in countries like Greece and Spain. Somewhat understandable. That cannot be the only reason, can it?
I think the distance between the management of the European Union and the population has never been reduced. This situation where we are now was supposed to be a temporary phase, and then representation, real political representation, had actually to be introduced. This never happened. We know this. But I'm saying, just like if we think about what happened in the last months, like big negotiations about energy, for example. You have China with Putin, you have Russia with Putin, you have China, and maybe sometimes you had representatives from the US government who was negotiating for the EU. Commissioners, people that had not been elected. Now for trade, which is even more important for small and medium enterprises from Europe, they are represented by people that are not elected, and they are actually negotiating with people that are elected in other countries. So it's no wonder that people are not just protesting about the problems on the economy, but also on the fact that they don't have a say on what these people are going to do at international level.
Well, they do so now. They do so now because the European Parliament is the only directly elected institution in the European Union. So they do have a say. Now, the European citizens anyway, this week. But is this responsibility even, perhaps? Is this properly appreciated?
I don't think people, generally speaking, have caught up with the extra powers that have been given to the European Parliament in the Lisbon Treaty, the power to have an equal say over the budget of the European Union with the member states was a really big step. And we saw quite a big battle last year over the annual budget, which was won by the member states in the end. So the European Parliament is beginning to flex its muscles, and what people must see is the European Parliament actually making big changes to the way Europe is run in order to then want to vote for their members of the European Parliament. At the moment, I think you get people, certainly in Britain, I speak for my own country, thinking if I vote for the Labour candidate or the Liberal candidate or the Conservative candidate, I'm not sure how they're going to behave differently when they're voting in the European Parliament chamber. I'm not really sure what they're voting on in the European Parliament chamber. And if people know anything about the European Parliament, they know that they can't propose laws, they can only tinker with them. They can change them a bit. And that's not good enough to motivate people to really come out and vote for them.
Well, it's not good enough to motivate them, says David Charter. So Ulrike Gero, this is your opportunity. Now, I know you're a very passionate European. So if this is your platform, convince the people out there to go vote. Why do these elections matter?
Because they matter, because we need more democracy, and this is precisely the point, also what Stefano mentioned. The thing is that the system lacks definitely legitimacy. It has obviously indirect legitimacy through the Council, but we do have a Parliament which has no right of initiative. The initiative, so the legal work, is done by the Commission. Then you have this sort of opaque European Council with, overnight sessions, and then people come out and this is the decision. So obviously people feel like the democracy is not at work, at least not democracy which is felt in an intuitive way, which would correspond to anything we know from Italy, UK and other countries. Yeah. So I think definitely that these elections we have the first elections also where we have two candidates who basically try to do what we call politicization of the system. We have Martin Schulz for the European Social Democrats, we have Jean-Claude Juncker for the People's Party, and we try to get a little bit this sort of political competition into the system, and I think this is a good thing, at least for the first time. We also had for the first time TV duels with the all these heads of the parties. And I think, in a way, integration is yesterday's word, because you say integration, you leave the authority about the degree of integration to the member states. And what we're all discussing these days is basically a social and a democratic crisis which needs a different institutional setup of the EU's institution. And that is what people are asking for. This is what make them vote, because the moment you feel like your vote has a say over who does what in the parliament, who gets the commission president in the first place, and then you can change policy, because Martin Schulz, for instance, says much more against, prosperity, social Europe, and Juncker is more on competitiveness and so on and so forth. So you have a choice. The moment you can point to people, look, that's your choice for a different policy in the EU system, I think we could make it happen.
And it's true what you're saying, of course. There was for the very first time a live TV debate, and as you're saying, now we're focusing more on the profiles of the people leading us. But do people really paying attention out there?
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, you cannot expect everything from the first time, yeah? I mean, the big disillusionment may come when none of the two heads of candidates may get the position of the President's Commission. I mean, this is still not decided whether either Martin Schulz or Jean-Claude Juncker will get the presidency of the Commission. But let's assume they will, yeah? It would have been the first time that we do have had candidates who run for a certain policy and who basically can tell citizens, vote for me and you get a social Europe, vote for me, you get a green Europe, vote for me, you get a competitiveness Europe, and so on and so forth. So, and I think that is what is basically happening also with pretty many bottom-up movements in Italy, elsewhere. And I think what then impacts is the generational dynamics of the discussion. I think the youth out there is much more receptive to these talks and these desire to reshape the democracy of the European system than sort of the older generation. And we will need to see how it unfolds. I mean, nobody can forecast what that parliament will be, what that parliament will, how it will behave, how the populists will behave. But let's assume that we get that politicization. I'm rather optimistic.
She's optimistic. Stefano, do you share that optimism? Because the blame that is being placed upon European politicians, mostly, if you ask people on the street, is these are faceless bureaucrats. We don't know these people, and they are completely detached from reality. They don't know our concerns. They don't know anything.
It's something typical of any politician, I would say. So
but perhaps more so for the European politician.
Yes, no, I mean, you're right. Sincerely speaking, I couldn't really get the difference between the proposals of the main German parties. They look more or less the same, because I mean, we have Angela Merkel saying we must be together successful in Europe. So together, what does she mean? Germany, Europe, I don't know. And then you have the leftist parties that say we want a social Europe, but that's also what Angela Merkel says and what actually the Social Democrats say. So the big new things, I think they actually come from the AntiEuro Party. But I don't see it as necessarily as a negative thing. If we have to quote Bertrand Russell, we might say that to create such a huge political union, you do need a period of tyranny. You call it representative, indirect, direct representation. On some extent, it's also tyranny. I mean, they have to set the rules, and they don't respond to voters. And if something goes wrong, they don't have to step down. So this is what's going on. The anti-Euro parties are actually the elements, the parties that are going to say, we want to change this system. So the current structure, because there is, of course, a power structure, techno-structure, as you said, but we might also call it resistance, lobbying, interest, whatever. Are they ready to give up power? Are they ready to listen to the anti-Euro party? So it's not the citizens that have to listen to Europe, but Europe that has to listen to its citizens.
Can I say a thing? I think this is perfectly the point. And the point is that, again, this election is basically framed between sort of mainstream parties, technostructure, and populist parties. And the populist parties, in a way, to put it that way, pose the right questions and provide the wrong answers. I mean, nobody here, I think, is thinking that we could unravel the euro. The euro is the basis for all our prosperity. Everybody, I mean, looking at Ukraine, we need Europe. We know all this. You know, so posing the right question but then providing the wrong answers is what basically fuels the populism now, because they lure ourselves into the illusion that we could go back to nation state and so on and so forth. Yeah, but here's the thing: if you want a different policy, you can only have a different, so the claim of a different policy, you need to be anti-system, which is that we are permanently confusing system discussions and policy discussions in the European debate. And this is what is basically the nasty element here. And so if you want a different policy in Europe, non-austerity, more democratic, more social, you have no choice, because this is not on offer. Yeah, so you need to be anti-system, and I think this is the problem of the current campaign.
That's the point. I mean, I think that especially if you read elite magazines and so on, they somehow have this claim, or it's basically in the back of the mind of the people that write the articles, that voters of anti-system parties are stupid or something like that. They don't perceive. But actually, they perceive what's going on. May I speak about Beppe Grillo? Is it allowed? Yeah. So Beppe Grillo, they say he's a clown. He just showed up and everybody has been voting for him. Beppe Grillo is a very talented politician. Exactly 10 years ago, I was meeting a guy in the Ministry of Communication in Italy, and it was Berlusconi time, so they were also checking things. And then on TV, and one on the screen, shows up Beppe Grillo for the first time after 10 years. And that's how he came back. It took him 10 years to be here. So carefully listening to what people wanted. And he can do it very well because he's a comedian in the end.
And David Chotter, it's been brought up a couple of times now, the so-called anti-Euro party, Eurosceptics, if you want to phrase it a bit more in a flattering way. But this could be the big story here. They could be the big winners. There are polls out there saying these parties could win up to 25% of the vote. We're talking about Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Marine Le Pen in France, your own country, UKIP, of course, and even here in Germany, the so-called alternative for Germany. Is that something that worries you?
I wouldn't say I was worried by it, actually. I do think, as Ulrike has pointed out, that these parties do have a wide appeal because they have spoken to the electorate about what is going wrong with Europe. As Ulrike says, they don't really have viable answers in terms of making Europe better, but they offer a constituency for voters who are otherwise completely disenfranchised, and without that, of course, there's not just apathy. There's hostility, really, to the system. What I think we might find in the new Parliament is a little bit more of a constructive engagement that might surprise you from some of these Europhobic parties. I do think that once the UKIP in Britain has probably more than 20 MEPs, they are going to be putting forward, in their own terms, more constructive propositions in the European Parliament, putting forward member initiatives and papers and amendments, which they haven't been doing up until now. Up until now, they've been completely a protest party who doesn't show up to vote. They have seats on committees. They don't bother to go. They get criticised for it. What we will see, I think, is some critical engagement, because imagine if they simply ignore the Parliament again for another 5 years. I think voters in 5 years' time, perhaps when the economy has improved and there's not the urgent reason of the economic failure to make a protest vote, they will drop these parties, these fringe parties. They will drop them unless they have tried to achieve something. If they're smart, they will be putting amendments, they will be trying to reform this European Parliament. And then we will see an argument between the anti-system people and the people who are defending the current system.
But Ulrike, I think the point here about these parties is not that they're out there to improve the EU, but to get rid of it.
But this is part of the problem. We still do not know how it will unfold to have 140 deputies, set populist representatives in the European Parliament. There are two choices. Either they really want to engage in legislative making and they want to be a constructive part of the Parliament. That's a little bit tricky. The other question will be in how many groups will they split? Because you cannot assume that Wilders and UKIP and Marine Le Pen and so on and so forth will go into the same party group. I mean, Bernd Lucke already from Alternative for Germany has announced that he will not sign up with Marine Le Pen. So you may have a lot of fragmentation at the margins. Yeah. So these are already two questions. And perhaps they just will use the European Parliament as a sort of scenery where they can do nice YouTube clips to shout or yell against Europe. Europe, you know, and this is it. So we do not know this. But as David said, and Stefano too, the crucial point seems to me they have valid questions and they pose valid requests. And as long as the sort of mainstream, or call it technostructure mainstream, is not ready to capture these demands and desire and to provide open answers to it, and that would be smart, to integrate basically parts of their request and to really tackle the question, how do we need to reform the system? What about a real bicameralism? How about a full-fledged parliamentarian system? Can we do a Eurozone parliament? Can it have right of initiative? Do we have a commission who does the legislation? Can we have a budget cycle which is coordinated with the parliamentarian cycle? And then you could make people understand, look, we are fledgling, we are shaping a really democratic system on EU level, and this system might be powerful, even more powerful than today the nation state, and that's where we go. The moment mainstream parties would be listening to this discourse, I think also that the populist fringes would melt away. But that's not happening. Yeah?
I think that it's right to talk about bringing a bit more politicization, especially into the Commission, for example, to give it a bit more visibility and credibility with voters who have political views. But it's also very dangerous, of course, because the most political commission we've ever had was the Jacques Delors Commission, and it ended up in a very deep battle with the Margaret Thatcher administration in Britain that really sowed the seeds of Euroscepticism in Britain. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But in that case, I'm saying it's a delicate balance to strike, because once you politicize the Commission, you set up perhaps even greater political conflict with the national states. I mean, I think it's an interesting idea. But
you're not angry at me if I say that you belong with merit to the stream of opinion of many British journalists that actually are somehow allergic to any politicization of the EU, or.
No, not really. No, I think that politicization can be a valid and good thing, but it needs to be handled with due respect to the voters, because if British voters do not have any buy-in to the current idea of Spitzenkandidates, which we talked about, which Ulrike talked about, how Jean-Claude Juncker is the candidate of the centre-right. Nobody in Britain can vote for him. We do not have a party in the EPP, the main centre-right party in the European Parliament. What you're doing by that, and this is why I say it has to be constructed carefully with respect to the voters, you are cutting out of the equation the British voter. So what is the point of them trying to vote in this election?
I'm sorry, can I add something? But the problem between Jacques Delors and Margaret Thatcher, somehow, maybe it was not Jacques Delors, it was Margaret Thatcher. I mean, she was the one that was opposing any increase in political representation in the structure, because it's clear that Britain has been profiting from the current situation. They manage the financial streams in Europe. They just are on the other side of the channels, and they are... it's a Victorian strategy, you know? They're an island. They see what happens. They have France and Germany fighting. Italy, it's a poor country, or... you know, a country of poor people, whatever. And so this is the status quo that maybe some people in Britain want to keep. And,
I think it's not the politicization per se, which is the problem. You can have politicization, but the problem the British have with Europe is where to draw the line on the powers of Europe.
Yeah,
that's a good place to start, I suppose. Yes.
If I may say this with all due respect, but that is also your choice. I mean, the UK has been half pregnant with Europe for 4 or 5 decades, right? So half pregnant is not working, yeah. And the problem is you are not in the Eurogroup. You don't intend to be in the Eurogroup, but whoever is in the Euro, and these are the Italians and the French and the Germans and a couple of 18 other countries. We do have a deeper need for fiscal, budgetary and policy integration. This is a given, just we already made the choice to abandon exchange rates. So you decide to be out of this, then fine. But then your right to sort of impact on what is happening in, say, continental Europe should be a little less. If you feel excluded, you're also excluded because you want to exclude yourself. So I'm not criticizing this. It's still your choice.
No, it's a positive benefit for the UK to feel. I mean, you say half pregnant. I mean, there's no such thing, of course. I mean, you are either in Europe or not in the European project. And Britain is in the European project in its own way. And it's carved out that
the real point, the most points of the current democratic and social crisis of the European project are linked to the fact that eurozone integration hasn't been completed. We did the monetary part,
but that's not Britain's fault, is it? That's got nothing to do with Britain.
Yeah, but this is what I'm saying. This has nothing to do with Britain. We are awfully sorry, so that's your choice to stay out or in. But if we go back to the continental crisis, which is a democracy crisis, institutional crisis, social crisis, it stems largely from the fact that we have an unfinished currency, which is only monetarily integrated, highly economically integrated,
the election,
but not politically.
How does your vote in this election, how is it going to change that for the better?
Yeah, we need to have, in a way, different circles of integration. I'm clearly in favor that the next most important goal is completion of eurozone integration. We need to build a democracy around an orphan currency.
But should I vote for a German MEP? Are they going to do that?
No, I mean, you're pointing to the uncompletion of the whole system, yeah? And I cannot go over this. But, I mean, let's start again. The eurozone integration needs to be completed in a fiscal sense, in a budgetary sense, and in a political sense. If the UK wants to join, then fine, then you do this completion with us. If you want to stay outside, you have institutional trouble with the rest of the continent. That's your choice, and by the way, our problem too. So.
And I think, for better or worse, we will not be able to answer the question whether Britain should stay in the EU or not on today's show. I think the points are valid and the arguments are being exchanged. But indeed, I would agree that there are perhaps more pressing issues like unemployment, youth unemployment raging on the European continent. The common currency is very much, or has been very much, under assault and has caused a great deal of grievances among the citizens. So I want to pick up on that, because I think if you talk to people on the street, this is their first and foremost concern. As Bill Clinton once famously said, it's the economy, stupid. And I think it's...
I am the stupid.
But the point I was going to make is about the Eurozone, Ulrike. What are we seeing there? What are we going to see there at the end of the day? It's been a lot of trial and error. Do you think a fundamental change in strategy after this election? Well,
I mean, it goes back to my little sort of fight, gentle fight with this, David, about this question. The problem is we are institutionally hijacked in an EU 28 setting, and in order to reform, we need all the votes, including the British vote. But the need or the desire of the Eurozone to integrate more, to have a completion monetarily, economically, politically, is a different one than of those who are not yet in the Euro. And that is the catch-22 thing. We have different needs than the others who are not yet in that Euroland. Euroland needs a democracy. That's the social question which is on the table. But we depend in an institutional setting from an EU 28 structure to do that institutional treaty change thing. And here's the thing. Either we go beyond and we do a Eurozone integration scenario which either bypasses the treaty, we find a different solution, we do a new constitution inside, whatever could be on the table if the system dares to tackle these questions and to go into them, yeah? Or we are basically deadlocked, and that's what we are all perceiving. We have all the feeling that something should happen, but nothing has happened. That's what I call the deadlock or the catch-22. We know we should jump into a different sort of European parliamentarism, democracy, and so on and so forth, at least for the Eurozone, and then we can leave it to the other countries, join or not. Yeah, on choice for the UK, for Sweden, for Denmark, for Poland. I would basically personally bet most will come. Poland would come, Denmark would come, Sweden would come, Czech Republic, they would come. Probably the UK would feel itself pretty isolated if the others would do that thing. Yeah, and but that's a choice we have to face, and we can only hope that by 2016, 2017, there is talk around for something like a new convention, that we will actually see this coming.
Well, arguably, employment and growth is the #1 issue on the minds of the European voters out there. But once again, are European politicians really paying attention? Are they focusing on this issue, or are they perhaps tackling issues that perhaps are not very high on the agenda of the voters? Let's have a quick look.
Europe remains an abstract concept to many Europeans. Decisions made in Brussels are often opaque, and some of them are controversial. The EU at one point even legislated the size and shape of cucumbers, for example. It also banned old-style incandescent light bulbs in favor of more energy-efficient alternatives. Many citizens think the bloc has a tendency to overregulate simple issues.
I think the EU should worry about the important things and leave minor issues to the countries themselves.
That kind of thing is generally the result of politicians being lobbied.
Still, at least when it comes to some things, most would admit there are more advantages than disadvantages to being in the EU.
I like the freedom of movement, for sure. And the euro, at least in most countries.
That I can work in Portugal, Sweden, wherever.
One of the biggest challenges, therefore, facing EU lawmakers is clearly explaining what they do to voters and encouraging them to play a bigger role in European democracy.
David Charter, the million-dollar question here. How do you get the voters more involved? And aside from the casting your vote on election day, how do you make them feel that they're really part of this European project?
Well, you have to deliver policies that affect positively the day-to-day life of those voters, pure and simple. Instead of getting stories about rather silly things coming out of Brussels, like trying to legislate on the olive oil bottles that go on your restaurant table, or trying to legislate for how much water goes in your shower or your toilet. These things are the stories which emerge. The things which the European Parliament is going to be doing in the next session may offer some sort of interesting and real debate for people to follow when they come to, for example, the trade treaty with America. Now, one thing that's been interesting for me is that in this debate during the election campaign that we're in, there hasn't been much discussion that I've noticed about the American trade treaty, which will really divide opinion in the new parliament between, if you like, the free traders and the more protectionist MEPs. And there could be quite a fine balance between them in the European Parliament. So you could find quite a big punch-up between MEPs, even MEPs within the same groupings. You could have French conservatives, for example, getting very angry with German conservatives about trying to agree the exact terms of this American trade deal. And just imagine a scenario where the European Parliament votes against it. We could then have a very big focus on what do we want from the European Parliament. Do we want it to have this power? Do we want it to have more power? Because it's clear from what Ulrike's saying and from what a lot of the pro-Europeans who want to make Europe more complete want to do is to give the Parliament its own right of initiative, to give it even more powers. It's not something which suits the British sensibility, as we've discussed. But I agree, it is perhaps, when you come down to it, it is the only way of engaging people more, is to give the European Parliament more responsibility and more powers, and to make people aware of that.
And Stefano, the mantra that is being always put out there by European politicians, especially now during this campaign by the so-called Spitzenkandidaten, is always the EU needs more transparency. Transparency is needed. But tell us, what does it really mean at the end of the day?
I think that transparency right now is not exactly what Europe needs, because otherwise you will find out how things are actually discussed there, and it's quite a bit of a mess. So the point is that I think the concept is a little different. We are talking about accountability. So David, you just mentioned the regulation concerning olive oil. So they were saying that if you provide olive oil on tables at restaurants, it must be in some sort of disposable containers, and
it must be sealed.
Yeah, it's crazy. And and so these kind of things, how do people actually can complain about this? We know that we know how it works in the European Parliament. So many people go there. There is a group heads that say you have to raise your hand or not when some vote is made. And some time something is proposed, but powers are very limited. This process has to be changed.
Ulrika, I can see you are not pleased about that.
I think we all agree that this bureaucracy thing is basically crap, right? But the thing is, does it come really from civil servants being in Brussels and thinking of cucumbers or something? And it does not. I mean, the problem of the EU structure is that basically, to put it very bluntly and not politically correct, is that both NGOs but also companies can better use the system. So much of the regulation stems from lobbyism. You know, it's just firms, they want a certain regulation, they work the Commission, they work the Parliament, then they get what they want, and then citizens are complaining. So that again points to the gap of democracy, because citizens, probably because of language factors and whatever, civil society in a European setting is less organized or less well organized than both lobby companies and so on and so forth. So that is one point we can point to. And I would like to come back to what David said about this bureaucracy legislation. You know, I mean, a strong parliament, by the way, should be in the British thinking, because you have the best parliament on earth. So strengthening a parliament is basically a very British thing, I would argue. But here's the thing. What we do, the legislative process in the European Parliament does not really correspond to the legislative process for at least not in the German setting. On economic things, if we look at two-pack, six-pack, all these, you know, things we had, it's detailed macroeconomic fine-tuning where you basically have regulations that, I don't know, 60% of all people should work until age 70, or that 70% of women should be in the workforce, and so on and so forth. The German Bundestag would never think of doing such detailed macroeconomic regulation. What the German Bundestag does is we create a level playing field. We have a certain level of social and fiscal and economic rules, and in there you have a market. So what we should do, at least for Euroland, is we should create that same level playing field, which is that we don't have a different wealth tax in France, and then the French get Belgium because they want to change passport just to pay lower taxes. We shouldn't allow Siemens to have a headquarter in Ireland to get 12 or 14% of corporate taxes instead of staying in Munich, and so on and so forth. So we are not creating that level playing field. Instead, we are doing a lot of, you know, over-regulated macroeconomic policy fine-tuning instead of just saying we are all in that boat, and there are a certain set of social fiscal rules which apply to everybody, and so companies cannot escape and wealthy French cannot escape to Belgium.
David, did you want to add to that?
Well, I think that, again, that would be a massive clash with the British sensibility, especially given that the tax is one area, of course, where the veto remains with national member states. So a country that benefits from that and wants to have a differential corporate tax rate like Ireland or like Britain would inevitably veto a measure like that, unless you took away the veto and made it qualified majority voting in the European Council. This is where the Britain will seriously diverge from the European Union project. It's not just with the eurozone, and I mean, you say that perhaps that the eurozone should have a single corporate tax rate, but then Britain will then make a lower one, and then there'll be. It will be more obvious the difference between Britain and Europe. That we will be heading so far in different directions that Britain will be forced, perhaps unwillingly, into a different status. That is, it's neither in Europe nor out of Europe. It will be forced into a different way. That may be the only way of making Europe stronger and making Europe better, but it will come at the cost of at least one member state, Britain, possibly others.
Since we're slowly approaching the end of the show, I want to ask all of you, aside from the nitpicking and the details of this all, Stefano, let's start with you. What is the essence of this election? What is this election about?
It's about Europe. I think that
what does it mean?
I think the next years in the European Parliament might be quite entertaining. The best years of the European Parliament in terms of drama have been when there were people with strong anti-Europe positions. There was that guy, the former Italian premier, forgot his name. Right, yeah, and just cannot say that. And so it was extraordinary. I mean, he could just ignite discussions and conversations and debate, although not in the most proper way. And I think that with anti-Euro parties strongly entering the parliament, the established parties, the incumbents, will have to take part of the discussion. So it's a big chance for a development in the European debate.
Ulrike.
Coming back to what David said, I mean, eurozone again, yeah? But in the eurozone, we knew from the very beginning that monetary integration without fiscal and political integration cannot work. So the task of today is no taxation without representation needs to apply for the eurozone. That is the only way to make it democratic. Having said that, democracy tops Europe. If we should consider that European democracy cannot be built because we do not want it, we are not eager enough to build it because resistance in the system or language or whatever, then obviously, and we think that democracy can only be democracy and social distribution can only be organized in the nation state, then then bad luck, yeah? Because then we should rethink the European project. So my argument here is we need to succeed European democracy, at least to start with the eurozone and to move from there, and this is the task of the next decade to come.
David?
We asked what the election is about. I think the mood of the election is one of frustration and disappointment, unfortunately, at what's happened in the last 5 years in Europe. People are frustrated that their vote will not really change things on the European level, so they're not motivated to vote for the pro-European parties. They're frustrated with their national governments, so they're motivated to vote for the anti-European parties.
Do you think Europe, especially considering the Ukraine debate, that this election is also about Europe either continuing to be a player or finally emerging as a player, as a cohesive bloc on the international scene?
No, I think that will be up to the national member states because of the veto over foreign affairs policy. Once again, wherever you have a veto, the real strength of the European Union lies with the member states.
Let me say this. In terms of historical equilibrium of the whole continent, especially since the Congress of Vienna, Quadriga and Metternich, everything was based on France, Russia, and in the middle a weak Germany, just so that no war would ignite in the whole continent. Nowadays it's different because Russia is also becoming strong, but Germany is strong. This is the new thing. So the big responsibility to counter the British arguments is of Germany. And so Germany has got the responsibility to build Europe now.
I completely agree. It's the German task to make an offer for European democracy and how to make it work. And just to say that one. But if you say sort of the nation state holds the authority, I wouldn't agree. The nation states were basically Vienna Congress in 1815. That Europe went down the roads, and the 20th century or the 21st century is to bring it back to the citizens, which is not the council-based, not the nation state-based Europe, but a Europe which is different from the Vienna Congress Europe, which is a Europe of post-nationality, where national sovereignty isn't that thing, and where we can get a strong Europe just because we get a strong eurozone which is fully integrated, which has a democracy, which can do social arbitrage and so on and so forth. And I think, again, this is the task for the next decade. We won't shoot it out of the hip, but perhaps with these elections we get one step closer.
Well, with that very passionate and final plea on the part of Ulrike Guérot, it's now up to the European voters to head to the polls and cast their vote for the next European Parliament. Certainly don't take it from the US Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, who once infamously said, F the EU. Let's not abide by her words. Let's all head to the polls and get our voices heard. I want to thank my guests for a very spirited discussion about the future and present state of the EU. With or without Britain remains to be seen. Thank you out there for tuning in, and looking forward to seeing you again next week for a new edition of Quadriga.